Good evening. Good evening, everybody. I'm Jennifer Scanlon, Interim Dean for Academic Affairs at Bowdoin, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the 17th Annual Brodie Family Lecture. Each year, because of the generosity of the Brodie family, the college's education department has the pleasure of hosting a speaker of note in the field of education. The Brodie Family Fund was established by the late Ted Brodie of the class of 1952. Ted was an overseer of the college from 1983 to 1995. His daughter Karen Brodie Doyle, who is with us tonight, is a member of the class of 1979, and her daughter Emily, Ted's granddaughter, graduated in 2009. 3 of Ted's other children also graduated from Bowdoin. Glenn in the class of 1976, Beth in the class of 1982, and Mark in the class of 1987. Ted was a passionate student of history and of lifelong learning. He established this fund to provide lectures on the problems and practices of teaching and learning by experts in the field of education. And we have long been and we remain grateful for his support. Tonight's lecture is unique, though, in that it also contributes to the celebration of a special event at Bowdoin, the founding of Upward Bound at the college 50 years ago this year. You may know that Upward Bound is a college access program that assists high school students who come from low-income households and are the first generation in their family to attend college. Upward Bound's mission is to ensure that participants not only have the skills and knowledge to go on to college, but also have the experience and resiliency to complete their degree programs. More than 900 Upward Bound programs exist nationwide. Bowdoin's program was among the first in the nation. Since its inaugural 50 years ago, Upward Bound at Bowdoin has supported thousands of Maine students in their goal of achieving a college degree. The program currently works with over 100 students from 11 Maine high schools, providing an intensive residential summer program and academic year outreach support. It is therefore quite appropriate that our speaker this evening takes as her central concern higher education attainment and especially college and university access and completion for students who not very long ago were labeled non-traditional. That is, racially, ethnically, and socioeconomically underrepresented students who today make up a significant share of all college and university enrollments in America. Laura Perna, our speaker, is Executive Director of the Alliance for Higher Education and Democracy and the James S. Riepe Professor of the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Perna received her PhD in education as well as a master's degree in public policy from the University of Michigan, and she holds not one but 2 bachelor's degrees, one in economics from the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School, and one in psychology from Penn's College of Arts and Sciences. In directing the Alliance for Higher Education and Democracy, Dr. Perna leads scholars in applying a multidisciplinary, research-based approach to addressing pressing issues regarding higher education societal contributions, both in the United States and around the world. She's the author or co-author of dozens of books and essays, among them The State of College Access and Completion, Improving College Success for Students from Underrepresented Groups, and Understanding the Working College Student. Dr. Perna has received numerous awards and honors and has been identified by Education Week as one of the top 50 most influential voices in education. We are extremely pleased that Dr. Perna is with us this evening. Please join me in welcoming her.
Good evening. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And thank you very much for having me here today. It's such an honor, Karen. It was wonderful to meet you earlier. And thank you to you and your family for sponsoring such a wonderful type of event that brings folks together in a community to talk about important issues facing education in particular, but really our society more generally. I'm also thrilled to be here as part of your celebration of the 50th anniversary of Upward Bound. Upward Bound is a program I care deeply about. I've spent quite a bit of time thinking about the roles of different types of college preparation programs and trying to improve college access and success for students. And so I'm thrilled to be here as you celebrate the long-standing work that you've done in this area. This occasion is an important time to mark, so celebrating the 50th anniversary of Upward Bound and the Higher Education Act more generally. So for more than 50 years now, we've been devoting considerable time and resources into this issue of how we improve educational attainment for all students, regardless of demographic background. We've certainly made progress on these issues, but there's a lot more work to do. And so this is really the central focus of my talk. So one of my guiding passions is that I believe that improving higher education attainment and really closing the gaps in attainment across groups is one of the most important issues facing us in our time. Tonight I'm going to call for a more comprehensive approach as a way forward on these things. And so I'll try to talk through three different issues. So why is it important to improve higher education attainment? And I know many of you know this, you're living it, you're trying to do it, but I think it's important to step back and look at the data and think about how we make the argument, because not everyone actually believes this, right? So how do we make the case for what it is that we're doing? Second, I'm going to talk about what we know from theory and research about how to improve higher education attainment. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about the roles of public policy and institutional practice. So I know Megan's here from Penn, and hopefully there are a few other people who are familiar with the University of Pennsylvania. I'm going to start briefly with a photo of Benjamin Franklin, the founder of University of Pennsylvania. And I think that this is appropriate being here at Bowdoin also, because there's a strong commitment from Benjamin Franklin that lives on through our university in how we take our research-based knowledge to try to improve practice. And really this is oriented towards thinking about the public purposes of higher education. What is the good that we're trying to accomplish? One of the quips that's been attributed to Ben Franklin is that an investment in knowledge pays the best interest. And so this is a quote that continues to be quite true today. And in many aspects, I think perhaps is more true than ever before. We hear this, we heard it for those who watched the Republican debate last night. This was Marco Rubio and others talked about the importance of college and the ways that we improve college affordability. Part of the rhetoric that's out there is around how the U.S. has lost ground with regard to the educational attainment of its population compared to the populations of other nations. So I know there's a lot of detail on this slide, but the blue arrow points to the U.S. And you can see with the blue bars, hopefully, that points to what is now the older generation. So among older Americans, educational attainment of adults is highest among these other nations. But the red bar is the younger generation. And here you can see that other nations now have higher shares of that segment of the population that's attained at least a bachelor's degree credential. And so among those leading nations are Norway, Poland, Netherlands, United Kingdom, Korea, Finland. So this is part of the conversation that's going on from a policy perspective. Part of why it matters, so being number one is clearly an American type of goal in many ways, but it matters more than just ranking first. There are real issues with regard to why higher education attainment is important. And this slide, I think, summarizes some of the important arguments here. So if the bottom line shows the average earnings of high school dropouts controlling for inflation. And you can see that the real earnings of folks who have not completed high school have gone down over time. So this is clearly one important societal issue, making sure that folks complete high school. Earnings for high school graduates have remained relatively flat compared to after controlling for inflation. The top line is the average earnings for folks who have attained at least a bachelor's degree. And here you can see that, especially over the last 15 years, that premium that's associated with completing a bachelor's degree has gone up over time. And this is part of why it really matters who's getting the opportunity to go to college and finish college. They're real individual benefits. There are, of course, also societal benefits that are implied in this graph, right? So when earnings go up, so does the tax base of citizens, and so that matters. And we also know, of course, that there are a whole host of other benefits that are positively related to educational attainment that are not captured on this graph. So individuals benefit from better working conditions, better health, longer lives, and society is also better in many important ways. Folks are more civically engaged, higher voting rates, lower crime, the list can go on and on. So why are earnings going up? Well, part of why earnings are going up with regard to so positively related to educational attainment is that increasingly the available jobs that we have in the US require some level of post-secondary education. So the prior graph really emphasized earning a bachelor's degree, but here, and there's also a benefit for less than a bachelor's degree. Here's just the sharp contrast between the share of jobs that require no more than high school, and you can see the dramatic decline. So 72% of jobs in 1973 required no more than high school, down to 36% projected by 2020. Conversely, the share of jobs that require a bachelor's degree or more has been increasing over time. These data come from Anthony Carnevale and his colleagues at the Center for Education and the Workforce in Georgetown University, and they project that at the current rate of degree production, the demand for workers with at least an associate's degree will exceed the supply by 5 million by 2020. So there's an important economic competitiveness argument there. So part of what, so far I've showed you, and we've talked just about the averages. So part of what's going on and what's important to this argument is that the US cannot get to the levels of educational attainment that are required for international competitiveness or workforce readiness without closing the really profound gaps in attainment that persist across groups. So in the United States, we know that college-related outcomes continue to vary based on family income, race, ethnicity, parents' education, and a host of other demographic characteristics. As I'm going to talk about a little bit more, it also matters where you live. So educational attainment varies dramatically based on the state that you live in. It varies based on the high school you happen to attend, and other sorts of dimensions like that. And so really at the crux of what I'm going to talk about tonight is how important it is to close these gaps. So there are a lot of different slides I could show you with regard to documenting the gaps in attainment across groups. Here's just one showing educational attainment by race, ethnicity, and here you can see the dramatic differences across groups. So I guess the good news is that regardless of race, ethnicity, educational attainment has been increasing, right? So we do have some improvement. But the gaps persist. So it's a two-part story. Progress, but still these profound gaps across groups. So in 2012, 60% of Asians, 40% of whites have attained at least a bachelor's degree, compared with 23% of blacks and 15% of Hispanics. And given those differences in earnings, this is an important issue, not only in terms of international competitiveness, but also for social justice reasons. The prior graph, of course, also masks other differences, including differences in attainment by gender within racial ethnic group. And so here you can see that on average, regardless of race, ethnicity, educational attainment is higher for women than for men. Of particular concern, I think, are the low attainment rates for African American men and Hispanic men. Okay, so part of why race ethnicity matters is that the racial ethnic composition of our US population has been changing. So here you can see, whereas whites were the majority of high school graduates, that's, by 2027, you see clearly whites are just about half of the population of high school graduates. Hispanics are the fastest growing population, but as you recall from this slide and the prior, educational attainment is among the lowest on average for Hispanics. So yeah, some important issues facing our society. And there are other issues, of course, that are important and embedded in here that are not documented per se on this chart, including trends in immigration and things like that. Okay, so what do we know about how to improve higher education outcomes for diverse populations? There's been quite a bit of research on this topic. So I've been looking at these issues for my whole career. My dissertation focused on the role of financial aid in paying in students' choice of college. Early studies of, I've focused on trying to model statistically how students make decisions about going to college. I've also done research where going into high schools to try to understand how the high school context matters and how resources, and so part of what I've learned through that type of research is how dramatically the resources that are available to promote college opportunity vary based on the high school you attend. So the availability of academic courses, the availability of counseling, things like that. Another wave of research is focused on the role of state policy. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about those studies in a few minutes. I've also tried to done studies that isolate the effects of particular types of policies and practices, like international baccalaureate programs, pre-college outreach programs, financial aid, and things like that. And most recently, I've been involved in some international research and trying to understand how educational policies and practices play out to influence educational attainment in different contexts. And it's been helpful for me to step out of the US context to see how some of these things play out in other contexts. It provides some insights if you can get out of your own context and see things through a different set of eyes. So clearly, one of the lessons is there's no one study that provides us with the answer about what's working, how to solve these problems. But I think together, from this body of research, from mine and other research, we've learned quite a bit about what does matter. So one of the things that we know that adds to the complexity is that this is a cumulative longitudinal process, right? So I could have, as you know, have drawn this arrow where it would be far out to that side, basically starting at birth, right? So that the opportunities that folks have and the resources that are available. I understand Sean Reardon was here last year to give this lecture, and his data are just so powerful in terms of how the differences in academic resources start early based on family income. So, part of the challenge is, well, where do we start, if we want to make a difference with the educational attainment process? I'm going to start with the transition from high school into college. So clearly there are many points of intervention, but this is one of those that does matter. So we know that college enrollment rates vary based on family income. And again, you see a similar story as to that the slide I showed you of differences in educational attainment by race ethnicity. So progress, there's a general upward trend over time in those college enrollment rates, but depressingly small changes in the differences across groups in college enrollment rates. So even still in 2012, a 30 percentage point difference in the likelihood of going to college between those from the lowest family income quintile and those in the highest family income quintile. Even among those who enroll in college, the likelihood of finishing depends on family income. And so here you can see just 26% of those from the lowest family income quartile finished a bachelor's degree within 5 years, compared with 58% of those in the highest family income quartile. These are really dramatic differences. And there's a lot that's wrapped up into this that we could think about, well, what's driving these differences? But these are very differences in life outcomes for folks based on family income. Okay, so what do we know about how students, let's start by taking this process from the student perspective. So at the core of the research that I've done and how I started out my line of research on this was using human capital theory and trying to understand the ways in which students are making decisions about college. Human capital theory assumes that students are weighing the benefits with the costs and choosing the option that has the greatest net benefits. Human capital theory doesn't assume that people have perfect and complete information when they make these choices, only that they use the information that they have available. So if you are acting based on the information that you have to make your choice, then that's a rational choice. And we know, so there are a whole host of costs, of course, that we know, the direct costs of attending, as well as the psychic costs of going, and the resources that folks have available to pay those costs vary dramatically. This issue of how people, what the information that people have, though, to inform these costs has been something that I've thought quite a bit about, and I think that's it's part of at the crux of making a difference on these issues. So we know from drawing on sociological theory that students are making these decisions and evaluating their costs and their benefits based on the context that they are embedded in. So there are three basic categories of things that matter in the college enrollment decision. Students consider their academic readiness, they consider their financial resources to pay costs, and they make those considerations based on the information that they have available and the support that they have to make those choices. But their assessment of their academic readiness depends on the characteristics of the schools that they attend and the academic resources that are available on those schools. Their assessment of their financial resources depend on the student's family income and the availability of financial resources from the college or university that they attend. It depends on the tuition that's charged by an institution. The information that they have depends on the counselors that may be available or not in the schools that they attend, the extent to which students have others in their community or in their family who have gone to college, and things like that. So in short, human capital theory emphasizes student agency, but really when we think about these decisions more comprehensively, we know that there are structures in place that influence the extent to which students are able to make informed choices and the extent to which they really are academically ready and with the financial resources that are required. So what are the roles of public policy and institutional practice in closing the gaps? So as you probably guessed a little bit from how I've just talked about this, one of the keys, I think, for moving forward is recognizing the systemic and structural barriers that are in place that serve to limit opportunity and outcomes. We have many policies in place that have been adopted with the goal of closing gaps across groups. But despite those policies, including Upward Bound, we continue to have these important gaps. And so thinking about how these different policies and practices play out and how they come together to shape opportunity, I think is a productive way forward. The onus to make a difference on these issues shouldn't be on students and families. I think thinking about the roles of public policies and institutional practices is the key here. So as Jen kindly mentioned in the introduction, so this is one of the books on this topic that I have. And in this, it's an edited volume that draws on perspectives from folks like Bridget Terry Long, Steve Desjardins, Jim Hearn, David Connolly. And what we tried to do in this book is look at the different points in the educational pathway from high school into and through college for different groups of students to try to understand, well, what really is making a difference with these different college-related outcomes. In the final chapter of the book, I offer these 6 recommendations that really seem to cut across the chapters. So the first 2 really fall in line with the importance of academic readiness. So academic readiness matters for student success, but we have a lack of alignment in the educational requirements and expectations between K through 12 schools and between colleges and universities, as well as between different colleges and universities as students are trying to move across institutions. There's a common set of recommendations around how we improve college affordability. So improving the ability to pay college costs and ensure that students know about the availability of college and financial aid, both of those things matter. We also know consistently from the research that practices have to be adapted to reflect the diversity of students, institutions, and states. And that finally, we have to be continually evaluating the extent to which the work we're doing is making a difference. One clear lesson is that there's no silver bullet, so there's not one magic practice that's going to allow us to solve these problems. Public policy matters for several reasons. So one, public policy is an important lever given those public benefits of higher education. So public policy is a lever that we have for increasing the demand for higher education and increasing the supply of different higher education institutions. With regard to higher education, the federal government plays a large role, and we heard some of this referred to in the debate last night. These data are from 2013-14. The total amount of aid awarded to undergraduates from federal sources was $184 billion this year. So that's a lot of money, right? Most of that, the most common, so the bottom row is for federal loans. 34% of the federal aid is in the form of loans. And so that's part of why loans are being talked about quite a bit right now. 18% of the federal student aid for undergraduates is in the form of Pell Grants. Pell Grants are very important, as you probably know. So Pell Grants are targeted based on financial need, and unlike loans, they don't have to be repaid. This graph shows what's happened with Pell Grants in real dollars over time. So the bottom line is the maximum Pell Grant, and you probably can't see this from the because of the scale, but we have a little bit of an uptick in real dollars in Pell Grants, especially during the Obama administration. But the slope of the other lines, which represent tuition and fees, the sticker price of tuition and fees has been going up. And so the gap between the maximum Pell Grant and tuition and fees is getting larger over time. And that's what, when we talk about the decline in the purchasing power, that's what's going on here. So federal Pell Grants are important, and we somehow figuring out how to keep financial aid in pace with increases in tuition is part of this affordability challenge that we're facing right now. So federal policy matters, especially with regard to authorizing upward bound, authorizing student financial aid programs. I want to spend a few minutes talking about the role of state policy. So in the United States, state policy really, the assumption of the book that Joni Finney, my colleague at Penn, and I published is that state policy is really where the primary responsibility is going to be if we're going to make a difference on higher education attainment. So why? So each state has its own structure for education, both at the K through 12 level and the higher education level. It also has its own policies with regard to improving higher education attainment, and all states have their own policies in place. Oops. Let me tell you a little bit about what we did, and then I'll show you some data about how states vary. So we did case studies of 5 states, Georgia, Illinois, Maryland, Texas, and Washington. And the goal of our study was try to understand what are the public policies in these states that are and are not promoting educational attainment overall, and how are those policies contributing to gaps in attainment across groups. So we spent 2 years in the field. We had a great team of students helping us on this project. We collected a range of data. We spent time in each state interviewing folks from the governor's office, the state legislature, presidents of universities, folks in the K through 12 system, and others who had information about higher education. Depending on the state, the particular individuals varied somewhat. So of course, our 5 states cannot be representative of all 50 states, but I'll show you a few slides that explain why we we picked these 5 states. So we wanted to pick states that had high shares of racial ethnic minority groups in their populations. So Georgia and Maryland, high percentage of blacks. Texas, high percentage of Hispanics. Growing Latino population, especially in Washington. And Illinois was more comparable to the national averages in terms of race ethnicity. We also wanted to have states that had large shares of their students in community colleges. So community colleges are a really important point of entry, especially for students who are underserved by traditional higher education institutions. So high shares of low-income students, high shares of racial ethnic minority students, high shares of older students also. So this slide gives you a picture of how much educational attainment varies just based on the state in which you live. So it's about a 20 percentage point difference between West Virginia at the low end, so that's the share of folks who have at least an associate's degree, and about 47% in Massachusetts. So really very dramatic differences. Our states also varied, of course, so Maryland was our relatively high achiever, and Georgia and Texas had lower rates of attainment. This slide gives you a sense of how much the stories varied across the 5 states. So, and I'll just tell you a little bit about each of the stories. So anybody here from Georgia? Yeah? How about Illinois? Okay, good. Maryland? I know. How about Texas? Okay. And then Washington? Okay, so when I tell you about Texas and Illinois, you can tell me whether you think how this resonates with your experiences. So in Georgia, as you may recall, so Georgia average attainment below the national average. And a very high share of African Americans in its population, right? So one of the findings in Georgia had to do with the extent to which educational attainment was low and policies in place that seemed designed to perpetuate the disparity. So one of the policies in Georgia at the time we were there was the Georgia Hope Scholarship Program. So this is a program that awards generous amounts of financial need to students based on academic criteria only, no financial need criteria. We know that students who have the highest level of academic achievement tend to be folks with the higher family incomes and white rather than African American. There is a generous Hope Grant program that's designed for folks who are attending the technical colleges. And so students from low, and note, at that time, relatively low academic criteria, right? So anyone who went to a technical college could get the Hope Grant. This has changed somewhat with the economic downturn. But just as an aside, we were in the States collecting data at the height of the recession, so it's really an interesting study, and we can talk more about that if you're interested. So disproportionate enrollment of low-income students of color in the technical colleges, disproportionate enrollment of higher-income white students in the degree-granting institutions, and limited ability of students to move across sectors, right? So that's part of what led to our headline of perpetuating disparity. Illinois, high-achieving state in the early 90s, really very high rates of participation in college, completion of college, affordability. Well, Illinois had a very well-regarded need-based financial aid program. One of the things that happened in Illinois is they shifted the construction of their higher education system, moving away from a system of systems of governance to giving individual higher education institutions much more autonomy, right? So what do you think happens with that? Are the interests of the institutions the same as the interests of the state, right? So colleges and universities don't have the same priorities, right? And part of that shift involved shifting a responsibility for setting tuition, right? And so institutions are trying to accomplish many things, but not necessarily what the state is trying to accomplish in terms of improving educational attainment, closing gaps, things like that. Maryland, as you may recall, are a high-achieving state in terms of educational attainment, but still gaps across groups, right? So Maryland is a relatively affluent state, it's small, so a lot of things really going well. Maryland also had made good progress in terms of developing a comprehensive system of higher education finance. So it was the only state that, of our 5, where the state was trying to think about how financial aid, tuition, and appropriations work together to influence affordability. That was one of the positive things from Maryland. In Texas, hard choices ahead, so also below average attainment in Texas compared to the national average, and large gaps across groups. One of the positive things when we were there, so Maryland had a master plan called Closing the Gaps. And people that we talked with knew about the plan. It was being used in trying to assess performance and really move institutions towards achieving some of those goals. Challenge, though, when we were there, so at the same time, there was also an interest of the research universities in the state to have more funding allocated to research universities so that Texas would be more like California or other states with nationally regarded research universities. And so the hard choices ahead headline really gets at the question, well, if we have finite resources, how do we make choices, right? Do we allocate them to increasing the prestige and resources of research universities, which enroll relatively small shares of students from low-income student groups, right? Or do we focus those resources on improving attainment for all students? In Washington, the story was, so Washington also has above average national, in terms of educational attainment, above the national average. The need in Washington, if you think about some of the large employers there, the need while we were there was to have more bachelor's degrees produced, right? So Washington has very high rates of bachelor's degree completion, but relatively small shares of students enroll in the four-year institutions. There's a very large, extensive community and technical college system, but challenges in moving students from the community colleges into the four-year institutions. We call that chapter State Policy Leadership Vacuum because Washington was very good at establishing plans, but not as effective in implementing plans. So having a plan is good, but even better is when it's implemented, right? Okay, so for those of you who are doing research and thinking about, well, what do you say from a study like this? These are clearly really different stories, right? And so part of our task was to try to think about, well, what are the lessons learned, right, that might be transferable to other states based on what we found? And so here's a picture of the conceptual model that we developed from the study. At the foundation of our lessons learned is that state context matters. So telling Georgia, just get rid of your Hope Scholarship program isn't likely to be effective, right? So trying to understand the political history, the economic history, the demographic history, that has to be a starting point for thinking about, well, what are the right things to be doing moving ahead? A second conclusion is that there are really three categories of policies. And so we don't, and this shouldn't be a surprise because I've already said it a few times, we didn't come out at the end saying, do these 5 things and you'll solve the problem, right? What we try to do is think about the categories of outcomes that have to be achieved by public policy, think with the assumption that there are multiple types of policies that could get you to that outcome, right? So one of the goals of those policies has to be ensuring that students have, that we're using our fiscal resources strategically to ensure college affordability. So that's one category. A second category has to do with the extent to which we have public policies and really institutional practices aligned with these things that ensure that students can move smoothly academically between K through 12 and higher education and between our higher education institutions. And then the third category has to do with just the availability of higher education institutions, high quality institutions. And I'll talk about each of those in a second. At the foundation, so underlying those 3 buckets of policies is state policy leadership. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means. We built in a feedback loop just to try to make clear that this is not a one and done. If you figure it out, you don't have to think about it any longer. You know, the world is changing and this is an ongoing process. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this first category of policies. So, and really the idea here is the extent to which policies and practices come together to ensure affordability. So whether or not someone can afford to pay the cost of college depends on several things. At a public institution, it depends on the extent to which appropriations from the state are coming to try to keep tuition low. A second type of policy has to do with who gets the ability to set tuition. Right? And in several, I mentioned Illinois, but Illinois was not the only state that had shifted towards giving colleges and universities more authority to set tuition. And so figuring out where that responsibility is important in terms of determining affordability. A third category has to do with the structure of student financial aid policies, so the extent to which a state awards and appropriates money to financial aid, and then the criteria on which those aid dollars are awarded, so the extent to which they consider academic merit versus financial need. Now, our book really focused on state policy only, but there are implications here for other types of policies also, right? So we know, I mentioned earlier the role of the federal government in awarding financial aid, so that's another affordability mechanism. And colleges and universities also influence affordability in terms of the tuition that they set, the other costs that are involved, and the extent to which there's financial aid that's coming from institutions. We tend to think about policy from a research perspective and from a policy-making perspective in isolation, right? We think about each of these different levers alone, but it really is the sum, how they come together and how the policies interact that matter. And so part of what we try to argue here is that we need that more comprehensive approach if we're really going to ensure that college is affordable for all students. Okay, so the second category has to do with the extent to which students can move smoothly through our educational system. So we have so many different breaks or gaps in our educational system that work to the detriment of students who are least sophisticated in trying to figure out how to navigate it. One of the findings from our study, so all 5 of our states have had at one time, and many states have had some sort of body called a P16 or a P20 or a K20 council designed with the purpose of trying to figure out how to better align K through 12 and higher education policies. These entities have accomplished really very little in terms of creating substantive policy change that ensures that if you graduate from a public high school, you will be academically ready to enter college-level work, right? And we can see that. I don't have the data here in terms of the high shares of students participating in developmental education, but that's too common, right? It's an indication that we have to do more with regard to alignment. Now, part of what we heard as we were collecting data on this is that at least some states were waiting on doing more in this area until the Common Core state standards were rolled out. And so looks like maybe that won't be the solution on this. So more work is required here. We have to do better. Too many students are lost in that transition. Too many students also are lost, as I alluded to earlier, as they try to move from one higher education institution to another. So as I mentioned, community colleges are a really important entryway into higher education, especially from affordability perspective. But too many students so transfer rates from a community college to a 4-year institution are relatively low. Rates of completing a bachelor's degree are relatively low. And the extent to which students can make that movement without loss of academic credit is really, really important. So we found some examples of some initiatives that are being tried to try to do better on this. You know, many of the initiatives, even with some state policy, are institution-to-institution agreements. And that adds complexity for students, especially, again, for students who are least sophisticated in trying to figure out how to take the right courses from the beginning of entering a community college to make sure they stay on track and can make that transition. Clear implications for colleges and universities on these things too, right? So when the state policy isn't doing enough to make these things happen from a structural perspective, that creates some really important need for colleges and universities, as well as K through 12 schools, to try to figure out how to do better with these outcomes. third category of policies we call the optimization of system capacity. And Texas is the best example, but this happened we found this similar finding in all states. So this gives you a sense, Texas is really several states in one, right? There's so much diversity in terms of the educational needs, in terms of the characteristics of the population, characteristics of the higher education institutions. Coupled with that, Texas is, and I lived in Texas for a short period of time, so I can own this, right? Texas very much embraces local control, right? And so thinking about that cultural orientation coupled with, you know, Joni and I are trying to figure out, what do you say from a state policy perspective, right? So what is the role of a state in a place that values local decision making? And what's the role of a state given how many different things are going on? It's pretty challenging, right? But this is a real challenge, and all 5 of our states were facing it to some degree. So we don't have the public commitment to invest more public resources in building enough higher education institutions to make sure that there is a good option close to where everybody lives, right? So we have to figure out a way to better align the opportunities that are available with the educational needs of the population. We saw some innovative things going on in our states that we studied, and we raised these issues at the end as directions for future research, because some of them were emerging, and you know, we have some questions about some of them. So for example, a few of our states are now allowing community colleges to offer applied baccalaureate degrees, right? So that's something that, with the goal of increasing the availability of bachelor's degree programs, but probably has some important consequences for the mission of community colleges, for the allocation of resources, things like that. We also, in some of our states, saw some developing use of distance education, and so that's something I think that should be thought about some more. In all 5 of our states, really relatively little attention to for-profit institutions from a state policy perspective, and I think that's another important dynamic, especially when we think about the students that we're concerned about, right? Students from low-income families, students from racial ethnic minority groups. Those are institutions that are disproportionately enrolling those groups of students. Okay, so a 4th conclusion from our study is that equity has to be a priority of our public policies and our institutional practices. And if I were going to draw up that model, so I don't know, for those who, I'm going to show this again because it's hard to figure out how to draw a model, right? And so we're pretty proud of this. But if I were going to draw it again, somehow I would make explicit equity matters, because it really does. And we have so many policies in place that are not oriented towards that goal, right? And really even the extent to which we fail to ensure that all students are academically ready for college, the extent to which we fail to make it affordable, and the extent to which we make high quality options available, those are all things that work against people who are least well served by our systems, right? So anyhow, if anyone has ideas of how to draw that in, that's what I'm looking for. And then the 5th is just how important leadership matters. And so I alluded to this with the discussion of the Washington case. So you have to, and this was also true in Illinois, most beautiful strategic plan document that you could imagine, but it had so many different recommendations with no priorities. So just laying out a lot of different recommendations perhaps isn't helpful if you don't have resources to do them all. And also, it didn't have buy-in. So we would talk to people around the state, and people didn't have any confidence in the coordinating board or the plan. And so that's important to making change, right? So setting what the priorities are, getting buy-in for them, and then figuring out the policies and practices that can really achieve those goals is really, really important. And I think those conclusions play out if we're talking about state policy or institutional practices as well. So clearly lots of different pieces, right? So we know that there are many different forces that influence educational attainment, and we know that there are many different players. Part of the challenge, I think, is trying to figure out how to better align these efforts to try to achieve what I would hope would be some shared goals. And there's really more work that has to be done from the federal policy perspective, the state policy perspective, from K through 12 schools, and from colleges and universities. So clearly many challenges, and this is not new. So you know, here's just an excerpt from a speech that Martin Luther King gave 50 years ago. I would like to use as a subject from which to speak tonight the American dream. And I use this subject because America is essentially a dream yet unfulfilled. The substance of the dream is expressed in some very familiar words found in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is a dream. So we've clearly made progress since 1965, but we have more work to do, right? We have these profound gaps across groups, and higher education really does matter to the well-being of individuals and our society. So whoever we are sitting here today, I hope that these comments have been helpful, and I'll look forward to comments and questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Perna. So we have time for questions, and a couple of students have volunteered to run microphones around so that we can get everyone recorded. Compelled to volunteer. So if you'll just raise your hand, we'll get a microphone over to you to, so that you can be heard when you ask the question.
Hi, can you talk a little bit about the relationship of the state and private companies and how that plays a role with state policies and educational policies?
Yeah, great question. So this played out somewhat differently across our 5 states. In Texas, the private sector has been a pretty important driver of some of the changes in educational policy. So before the time of our study, businesses were part of the change in Texas to make the college preparatory curriculum the default in high schools. So basically you have to opt out if you don't want to be in the college preparatory curriculum, which I think is such a smart thing to do, right? This is so consistent with that nudge perspective, right? And it makes sense, right? So essentially in Texas, there's a realization that the population already is majority minority, right? So figuring out a way to do better with populations that are underserved and to improve the low educational attainment, the business community has realized that. Now, average educational attainment still, there's more work to be done for sure. You know, it was interesting. One of the things, there's been so many interesting things about this particular project. After the Washington report came out, so State Policy Leadership Vacuum, you can imagine that perhaps not all in Washington were pleased, right? So one of the calls we actually got was from the business community. So I went out, I took the plane from Philadelphia out to Seattle, and I didn't really know what was going to happen. Am I going to get chewed out, or is there people going to have issues with the findings that we had? And really what they were asking was how can the business community do better? And so that was, I'm an optimistic person, and so I took heart at the fact that they were asking the question, but also kind of discouraged that they didn't know a way in on some of these issues. So I think the business community perhaps is an underutilized resource, and maybe there are ways to think more systematically about really, so the business community can be an important part of this issue of developing a shared agenda around the public good. You know, what are the issues that we're trying to address with higher education? And I think that may have power with the political forces that are in place.
Ms. Perna.
Yes.
As it relates to the business community, I was wondering, I'm assuming that your support, meaning financial support to the education system, and I'm wondering if you're of the belief that if there's more money put into the educational system, it would relate to a better result in that system, and wondering how you what your feelings are regarding the collective bargaining system and how that impacts the entire, not only public but also private educational system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. So when I said support of the business community, I actually wasn't thinking about money. I was really thinking about using political capital to put things on the agenda and things like that. So I mentioned before that we collected data at the height of the recession, right? So we were in states February 2010 through for about a year there. And it was, we almost started collecting the headline. So part of our stops included going to the state capitals, right? And collecting the headlines in the cap of those newspapers about just how dire some of the state revenue shortfalls were. And so part of our challenge in thinking, we thought quite a bit about the role of money, because when we talked to state legislators and people in the governor's office, it was very much about the money, right? This is a terrible time, there's no money, we can't do anything. But the reality is, in looking at the data, the challenges were happening before the downturn, right? So it's not like the gaps in attainment suddenly appeared with the recession. That's not what happened. And I don't think that magically having more money is going to solve this problem. There are many issues. So money matters for sure. Money is important to college affordability in particular, but it's not all that's required. I was mentioning to Chuck earlier, a few weeks ago I was invited to go to an international conference on college access and really thinking about the role of markets, policies, and institutions. And there were folks from 15 different countries there. It was a great experience. Many of those countries, college is paid for by government, right? But they still have the stratification issues in place. And so that was really helpful. I'm still trying to puzzle through, because so much about the conversation here is around money. And I think that part of our focus on money, and again, it does matter, but I think it's one of the reasons why we've made less progress on the academic side. And the academics really do matter, right? So you have to be academically ready to persist through college, through degree completion.
Thank you. That was a lot of information. I'm wondering, given the nuance in the situations in each of your states that you looked at, who would you identify as the key players that would most benefit from your results and your findings? Maybe not in each, but we were talking about businesses.
Mm-hmm.
So who should read this, I guess is my question.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, we tried. So Joni Finney, my partner in this project, she came to Penn as a practice professor about 8 years ago. She was a vice president at the National Center for Public Policy and Higher Education before she came to Penn. So, and before that had worked with the California Education Policy Center, very much on the policy side of things. And so it was a great, like most collaborations that work well, it's great when people bring different perspectives to it, right? So I was very much bringing the research perspective. She was very much bringing the policy perspective. And one of the things that was really important to her and that I learned a lot about is how we can think about getting our results out there after we were done. And so before we published the book, we issued 3 to 5 page papers from each of the 5 states, and we tried to send them out to reporters and to legislators and college presidents in each state. And the reactions within states varied in the extent to which people picked them up. The media actually in all 5 states, we got attention and interest from media in all 5 of the states. I think the player, so who really matters in each state varies somewhat by state, right? So in Georgia, the legislature is part-time, right? So there's varying capacity. And part of what we heard in Georgia, not only part-time, but and this was true of other state elected officials. And there were some. Anybody a state elected official here? Yes. Challenging job, right? You have a lot of issues on your plate and perhaps limited staff, right? Yeah, no staff, right? And is this a term limited state? Yeah, right. So it's really, really hard to get up to speed on issues and try to understand how to make things happen in the short amount of time that you're in office. And so I think that's one of the lessons I took out of this was, if I could wave a magic wand and provide some resources somewhere, part of that would be to try to help our state elected officials I don't mean to say this in a negative way, but just get smart on some of these issues, right? And we had a few interviews where some of the state elected people were asking us questions about just trying to understand how things work, right? And which we're happy to help with, but that's, right? So I think that's one important area. The governor's office also does matter. Illinois, I know, right? Sorry. So Illinois was I was so depressed after we went to Illinois. Sorry, person from Illinois. Well, that was the thing, right? So we were there right after one of the most recent, but a string of governors have had political challenges, and with the depth of the fiscal issues, right? The underfunding of pensions and the corruption issue, though. So the governor, one of the things the governor gets to do is appoint people to serve on higher education boards, right? So we found profound distrust of higher education when we were there, and distrust of government. And that makes it really hard to do anything positive, right? It's my understanding now things are improving. I'm optimistic that things, and then college and university presidents, I think they're probably the toughest ones to change on this. Part of what we argue in the book is that we need to rethink some of the statewide coordination of higher education, right? So the state elected officials are the ones who are responsible for looking out for the public good, right? They're the ones, and I define the public good in terms of the overall educational attainment of the population, right? They're the responsible ones for the well-being, economic and educationally. And again, college universities, they have other priorities. They may care about these things, but it's only one of a lot of different things going on. And so I think if change is going to happen, I believe in government. So, yeah. Yes?
Thank you very much for your comments. You called yourself an optimist.
Yeah.
I'm in the midst of reading a book by Robert Putnam called Our Kids.
Yes.
I don't think he would be considered an optimist.
Probably not.
Because of some of the things he maintains in that book. And I would like you to comment on one of his theses, which is that poor kids in this country, kids from low socioeconomic backgrounds, don't have nearly a chance at success as kids from higher socioeconomic backgrounds.
Yeah.
And he maintains, I like what you said, he maintains that things are getting worse since the 1950s and 60s,
Yeah.
when I was raised by a couple of working class parents.
Right.
I'm sure you're familiar with his work, but do you have any comments on some of what he maintains in that work?
Well, so in many ways, things have actually gotten worse. So I do not disagree with that. I think we have to be optimistic, or how can we get out of bed and try to continue to make a difference on this, right?
I mean for your optimism.
Okay, good. I'm not giving up yet. I have years ahead of me. So I do agree with the central premise there. We have inequality that is structured into our system in too many ways. And it does start at birth, right? The extent to which there is inequality. I mentioned briefly, I have a presentation that has a slide from Sean Reardon. It's a very powerful slide, right? So in case you haven't seen it, one of his charts is, it shows the trends in a family's investment in academic resources for children, right? And so the line for the folks in the lowest family income quartile, flat, right? No change. The line for kids in the upper income quartile was like this, right? And so the gap over time in the investment that families are making is increasing. Another book with a similar kind of approach that is worth reading on this topic, also very depressing at the end, right, is Lois Weiss and her colleagues' book called Class Warfare. And so it sounds like some people in here have read it. She's done, they did ethnographic studies of 3 high schools that serve relatively affluent communities. And really the thesis of that book is how the families, the parents are mobilizing the resources that they have, right, to maintain the advantage, the social stratification that they have. So they're acting as rational actors, right? They know how important higher education is, but it's serving to further not only perpetuate the gap, but I think increase the gap over time. So, I've been thinking a lot about this. I don't know what to do about the rise, the growing, and this is a reflection, it's the same, it has parallels with the conversation about the growing income inequality, right? So they're linked together. Having more income gives you more resources to invest in advancing who do you care most about? Your children, right? So you invest in those resources to maintain your privilege. I don't know if we can stop the top, but I do think we have to do more to raise the bottom up at least, right? So, the difference in the resources that are available in the schools that are attended by students from different backgrounds is just so dramatic. In West Philadelphia, where the University of Pennsylvania is located, and I'm involved with some folks at Penn who are doing outreach into the community there, schools that have no AP courses, no counselors in the school. Philadelphia, and this has happened in other school districts too, right? When there are insufficient school budget revenues, right? Who do you count? Who do you cut? You cut the counselors, right? There are many ways in which inequality is structured into our system, and I think trying to figure out ways that we can chip away at that part. We have to address the structural inequality somehow. Yes.
I just want to follow up. What role do you think the UPenns and the Bowdoins of the world have to play in this whole process, and what can they do to overcome some of this problem?
I think that's a great question, and it's one that I think about. So at Penn, one of the resources we have there is the Netter Center for Campus and Community Partnerships, and Ira Harkavy, who's the director of that, he and I have thought quite a bit about, well, and he's more than I, what is the role of a selective research university in this issue, right? So we wrote a piece that argues that universities have several resources that should be mobilized on this. One is leadership, and I think that's actually an underutilized resource on this, right? So other institutions are watching what Bowdoin and Penn and this top sector is doing on these issues, and so I think that's an important role to take seriously. And that could also lead to catalytic type of change, I think, and I guess that's the optimistic part of me again. There's also another bucket of resources around human capital, so the extent to which there are faculty, staff, students at these places who are, at Penn there are quite a number of people who are really trying on a day-to-day basis to take what we know and make small change within our community. And I do think that matters. I think change has to happen at multiple levels. There's also a bucket of resources around financial resources. So Bowdoin, like Penn, also has generous need-based financial aid programs. And so those matter, right, in terms of individuals who are able to come to places like this without, with generous financial aid, need-based grant aid that enables them to pay the cost. There's still more work to be done. I've been talking to some people today about how there's so many challenges, I think, for students from low-income families when they come to places like this still that we have to be paying attention to. And maybe that's another way to provide leadership on this, is really to recognize the full range of things that matter to maximizing an opportunity like this. So, but I think there's more. I think that there's more to be done.
We've discussed how the approach needs to be comprehensive, which implies the requirement for a broad-based group of stakeholders to focus their attention on this issue. And you've also discussed how there are frequently vacuums of leadership. I'm wondering if you have an example of where there was not a vacuum of leadership that was able to see through implementation and track it and evaluate it, and what that looks like, because that's what we're facing here.
Yeah, great question. So our best example of that was in Maryland with the finance policies that were put in place. So a couple of, I think good things, and so I haven't been back to evaluate since we have been in the state, but just a couple of things that happened. So one was the legislature passed a law that linked increases in tuition to increases in family income, right? Also established a fund, like a rainy day fund, to help with the volatility of state appropriations, right? So that's right. And some of this was funded through a tax on businesses. So that's another way that business can play into this. And also, the third thing, so Maryland has a comprehensive plan for financing higher education that thinks about what the relationships are between state appropriations, financial aid, and tuition. The other thing, so Maryland, so it's hard to think about how change happens, right? So Maryland is a different kind of state in many ways, right? So high levels of current educational attainment, relatively affluent, relatively small, and with leadership, both elected leadership as well as leadership at the institutional level of folks who had some longevity, as well as some political leaders with direct connections to education, right? So people, like, things came together, I think, and so trying to figure out how to parse out the players from other sorts of things, I think that's part of the story. But anyhow, the governor was able to work, Governor O'Malley, able to work with the folks at the University System of Maryland and other institutions in the state to freeze tuition for a short period of time. So Maryland has, one of the issues in Maryland has been affordability. It's high cost state, and there's still issues to address with regard to affordability, but freezing tuition, thinking about how to stabilize appropriations to the institutions in return for those types of things on tuition. There's still more work to be done in Maryland, especially with regard to financial aid. I think Maryland has something like 28 separate financial aid programs. Like, that's quite a lot. Yeah. So.
Okay. There are lots of questions that come to my mind, but two in particular. As citizens, how can we help close that gap? How can we help the children who are in the lower socioeconomic population be more successful? Mm-hmm. Not necessarily financial assistance, but in what other ways? And the other question has to do with the shared goals of leadership. And I work at the University of Southern Maine. Mm-hmm. And so one of the questions that comes to my mind is, what is the role of the faculty in the university in that shared leadership, shared goals, helping students to be successful?
Right, great questions. So I think citizens matter on several levels. So paying attention with regard to the policy debates about higher education really does matter. You know, it's part of the reason why I've started to include that slide on Pell Grants in some of my talks is because there's a lot of it, that's a policy that people talk about, right? But it's so important, and I think it's not well understood. So I think paying attention to, and there's certainly other conversations that federal policymakers are having right now around loans. So paying attention, I think, and then figuring out a way to vote and to express opinions at multiple levels, right? So, you know, what happened, and I don't know, it's a good question, right? So, especially when we live in communities that are relatively privileged on these issues. I think it's, in New Jersey, I live in New Jersey, districts are very decentralized, and so figuring out how to influence opportunity in neighboring different districts that may have fewer resources seems like a harder thing to do. But figuring out a way, I think, to articulate what the issues are and how important it is to all of us as citizens to be doing better in terms of educational attainment and closing these gaps across groups. As faculty, I think a similar sorts of thing, paying attention to these issues really is important on multiple levels. So I'm chairing a tuition task force in my School of Education right now, right? So one of the concerns of the faculty has been that tuition's increasing, and taking a look at salaries and taking a loan debt, and we should be concerned about this, right? It's tough, right? I know I study this, but now being on this committee, figuring out how to think about tuition and understand the impacts of tuition is complicated, but faculty have a stake in this, right? And so we should be paying attention to that part. We should also be paying attention, I think, to the the mechanisms of support for students. So on multiple levels. So, I have a book on understanding the working college student. And part of the premise, and there was just a piece that came out this week. Someone else has done something more recent now on, I think it was Carnevale, right? On students who work during college. And this is something that faculty, I think, so this is perhaps a stereotype, but haven't paid that much attention to the other things that students have in their lives, right? We expect students to come to our class and pay attention to our class and do all the work in our class, and who cares about the other stuff, right? So part of the argument in my book is try to think about, well, many of our students are working, right? Working also is another mechanism to build human capital, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be a pull against the goals of education. If we could think about the synergy, you're getting a sense of how I think about things, but thinking about the synergies that are involved and the ways that those could be better connected, I think there are things that faculty could do with regard to recognizing those demands so that they're not necessarily always competing. There are also other issues for administration around, when classes are offered, when advising is available, given the other, not only working, but also perhaps parent roles or other sorts of things that students have. One of the issues at Penn right now that, we think about is, and perhaps this is a similar issue here, so there's been progress in the time that I've been looking at these numbers. The share of students, undergraduates who receive Pell Grants has increased in the 10 years that I've been at Penn, and that's great, right? But that's the number that gets measured. There are other things that we have to be paying attention to and understanding the extent to which students who come from low-income families actually are able to maximize the experience of being there, so being fully integrated. And I think faculty do play a role with that. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for being here with us tonight. My name is Walter Chacon, and I'm a junior here at Bowdoin. My question is about what role do you think students themselves play in this process? Specifically, what role do you think ethnic minorities and socioeconomically disadvantaged students play in this process of being the ones that are on the ground trying to reverse some of these systemic inequalities?
Right, great question. So I'm hesitant of things that try to put more things on students to fight, to be on the front lines with these things in creating change. But so I think a few things. So bringing attention to the issues and challenges that may not otherwise be recognized, I think is really, really important. So it's hard to address a problem or an issue when folks aren't aware that it's happening. I think a second thing perhaps could be, so I have some students now who have become involved in research projects with me, students from all levels, undergraduates, masters, doctoral students, and part of what they bring is personal experience and commitment, but now we're working together to develop research skills to try to think about, well, how do you take information about your personal experience to try to understand more systematically the extent to which these are playing out, and there may be policies and practices to try to improve outcomes for students from different backgrounds. So I think those two things in particular. Yeah. Coming to events like this is good.
Hello. Oh, sorry.
Hi.
So thank you very much for coming. I'm interested, as we're talking about like minority groups and underprivileged groups, in one of your first slides you showed 4 different groups, and Hispanics were at the lowest of reaching higher education attainment. And I'm wondering how much of that has to do with, that's probably the group with the most English language learners. And so what programs are in place to help those students stay in, or reach and stay in higher education, and not just get discouraged by like the system around them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've had a few opportunities to present on findings from the book, and one of the most important pieces of feedback about something that we missed in the study, I think, is paying attention to language diversity. So I think you're raising a really important point. I think it's not only within Hispanics, but I do think it's something that has to be, we have to be drawing more attention to how language is playing out across groups. Part of what we've done is use data that are available. And so thinking about how we get good data to understand outcomes and experiences based on characteristics like native language, I think that's something important that we should be pushing for. We didn't identify, I can't think of anything that came up in our study where anybody pointed to specific types of policies or practices that were directed to students based on language. The issues, we did have some interesting findings about how attention to race, race ethnicity more generally played out. So, and this is, I think, on my list of things to think more about. I mentioned before, Texas very much in the consciousness, the changing racial ethnic population in really interesting ways. In Georgia, we tried to ask a lot of questions about achievement gap, and pretty much well, at least with the people we talked with, the questions were deflected. It was very interesting, right? And so, I don't know, I think we have to be able to talk about what the issues are if we're going to try to figure out a way to address them. So, but changing racial ethnic, this is an important issue, I think, in multiple respects. Another important issue that's not really, it's not reflected here is immigrant status and undocumented students. And so that's another important limitation of our work that I think that these all require more attention. Yeah, it's good.
Okay, one of our concerns in the district where I work is raising aspirations, not just with our high school kids. Bowdoin has a wonderful program that we take part in the spring, where we bring our high school kids over here, a group. But with the starting at kindergarten, talking to our families. My grandson attends Penn Alexander in West Philadelphia, and I think the university is involved in that, and I guess my question is, what can higher education institutions do to help, starting as far down as kindergarten, to help raise those aspirations when we're talking about getting our kids even being interested in being academically ready?
Yeah, great question. Well, so the Penn Alexander School is I guess it's called a university-assisted school. So the University of Pennsylvania has been involved in development of various aspects of that school. Penn has tried to be involved in other schools within the district, and it's been challenging, right? So figuring, it's not easy to have these relationships, right, for many different reasons. But I do think that is one possible route, and this happens. There are other places where there are university-assisted schools. I don't know whether this has led to any sort of systemic change, and so that would be a question. You know, it's an interest. It's also, I think there are also other things going on, like admissions offices have, you know, in selected places have tried to reach out strategically and have different sorts of programs. I think they're probably more one-offs than more integrated types of programs. Certainly a university's partnership with Upward Bound and other types of outreach programs is another really important way, I think, to be involved. And I guess another type of way to be involved is to try to think about issues around transfer and articulation. So I was mentioning to some folks earlier today, Maryland and I believe Texas, so have established a few articulated transfer degree programs in the state. So Maryland has, if you complete an Associate of Arts degree in teaching, that degree transfers in total to a public four-year institution in the state. And so that's the sort of, that it required involvement from, this was a faculty thing, so faculty engaging in these conversations about, well, what courses are going to transfer and what are we going to accept? And, you know, there were a lot of issues there, but that's one way I think that really works to the benefit of a student if you can have those types of clearly articulated programs where a student can start at a low-cost community college, know that they'll take a certain set of courses, and then not have to start over when they get to a public four-year institution.
This actually picks up right on that. So recently there's been an increase in the call for free community college. You see it in Tennessee, and then Obama's come out in support of it as well. Some issues arise with that around tracking, lack of articulation agreements, and then stretching capacity of community college. Can you just talk a little bit about this as a potential solution, targeting equity specifically, and if it's tenable or not?
Right, great question. So some of this is in the details, right? So, I think you've alluded to some of the issues that I think have to be figured out. So the extent to which there are pathways for students who started a community college and who would want to go on to a four-year degree, we have to ensure that those are there. Another important detail has to do with whether these are first dollar or last dollar scholarships. So community college is largely, well, I want to be careful. So tuition is often covered for low-income students already at community colleges with Pell Grants and other forms of aid that are available, right? And so if now we cover all those if we cover tuition for everybody, then low-income students haven't necessarily gained anything, right? And there's still other costs that have to be paid, right? So it's not just tuition and fees, it's, you know, often living costs or transportation or books and supplies and other sorts of issues that have to be taken into account. And then, you know, I think a third category of things to think about has to do with the levels of support that are available for students after they enroll in community college. So the completion rates. So this is hard, right? Because community colleges do a lot of things, right? And so, you know, if I were from a community college right now, perhaps I would be arguing that completion rates aren't really a good measure because I'm doing many, many things, right? But the completion rates are low at community colleges. A low percentage of students who start, you know, even for the full-time students who complete an associate's degree within 3 years is pretty low. The share of students who say that they want a bachelor's degree who enter community college and then transfer to a four-year college is pretty low. So I think we have to figure out a whole host of different things like that. So those are the things that we have to think about. On the good side, I think it's important and I think it's useful that proposals like this get college affordability more in the conversation, right? And really, I think perhaps forcing a conversation, so is a community college a right? Right? So is that something as a society that we value and that we think should be? So is 16 years of, or 14 years of education something that everybody should have? Yeah.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.